We'll start in about 60 seconds. I always like to give our latecomers a moment's wiggle room. Welcome to our weekly Friday news briefing. I'm Sandy Close, Director of Ethnic Media Services. Today, we focus on a topic much in the news, the learning loss kids experienced as a result of the disruption of in-person instruction during the pandemic. Speakers will discuss programs and strategies that will help kids bridge the education gap and even get excited about learning again. This morning, we welcome Louis Friedberg, past Executive Director of EdSource and a veteran education journalist. We also welcome Allison Sokol, Assistant Director of P12 Policy with EdTrust, a national research and advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C., and with EdTrust West here in California. And we welcome Hei-Yin Kimner, Managing Director for the Community Schools Learning Exchange and a Senior Policy and Research Fellow for Policy Analysis for California Education. We're looking to our speakers to help us basically reframe the narrative from what students have lost to what students can gain. This is what we as reporters often find most challenging. It's easy to cover the reports on learning loss, but the challenge really is to find what could be working and make the opportunity of being back in school something that really opens the window into learning. We are live tweeting today's conference as well as live streaming it. We ask our speakers to please speak slowly, as I am doing, for our interpreters in Spanish, Korean, and Mandarin. You don't have to speak quite as slowly as I'm doing, but I'm making the point that often speakers get passionate and speak too fast. Reporters, please enter your questions in the chat box, and we will be reserving as much time as we can after each speaker to take your questions. We will be sending a video to all participants this afternoon, along with extended bios for our speakers and highlights of the briefing. So now let me turn the briefing over to my colleague Sunita Sarabji, veteran journalist and briefing co-coordinator. She will be moderating today's session. Sunita.
Thank you, Sandy, and thank you to all our speakers and reporters who are joining us today. We start with Louis Friedberg, who will discuss reframing the narrative to what might inspire kids to return to in-person learning. Louis will also discuss performance-based learning, connecting schoolwork with career pathways, and bringing art and music education back to school, which has been missing for some time. Louis, welcome. You need to unmute.
Okay, great. Well, great to be here and to be with my fellow panelists and all of you who are doing such important work, bringing these issues to readers and listeners throughout the country. I think it's been such a difficult couple of years that sometimes it is hard to see or to stay focused on what some of the positive things that have come out of the pandemic. one of the most positive things, I think, is that it's underscored the importance of schools. And this crosscuts both the right and the left. Everybody wanted to get kids back in school. The right wing was criticizing, the Republicans were criticizing Democrats for not doing enough to get kids back in school. And there's nobody who didn't want to get kids back in school. And in fact, parents, for the most part, were desperate to get the kids back into school. Students were desperate to get the kids back into school. Of course, that was tempered by real health concerns. But in general, very few people wanted to stay out of school. So this also was very refreshing to me as someone who's written and reported about schools for many decades, that enthusiasm about schools. Also, one of the things that happened in most states, more money for schools and for programs that could actually assist students and parents, get through the pandemic, but also to help schools work with kids more effectively. The other thing that I think was hugely important is that, and this cross-cutted both Republicans and Democrats, the narrative was that schools were important, not just for learning, not just for the 3 R's, the reading, writing, and arithmetic, but for a student's physical and mental health. I think you all read about how schools were viewed as essential for getting food and meals to kids. And that was one of the strongest arguments. Even President Trump made that argument. Kids need to be in school to get food. I never really heard those arguments across the board like that. So those are the positives, and that is what we want to build on now going forward. Unfortunately, what's happened in the last few weeks and months since students have been back, and most students are back in school now, is this focus on learning loss, on students doing poorly. And it is true. There is very disturbing and discouraging data coming out that many students, and the students who were already struggling before the pandemic, many of them are now doing worse. But the narrative, I think, has shifted too far again. And one of the reasons journalists become journalists is to focus on what's not working. So it's natural that one would then want to report on, we sent kids back and they are failing. But I think the key here and now is to focus on what can be done and what can be done to engage students now that they are back. Because this would be a tremendously lost opportunity. You've got all these kids coming back, and I'm hoping the door hasn't closed on it already. Kids coming back really excited to be back, really wanting to be back. And how do we seize this moment where kids want to be back and build on it? Because it is clear that if we just continue to do things the way they were done before, for many kids, this is not going to work. Of course, there are many teachers and many schools around the country who are doing extraordinary work and have really succeeded with kids. But we just know that there are too many kids who are not succeeding, who are disengaged from education, and we need to figure out new ways, not necessarily new ways, and I just want to point to some of them now. I know we don't have that much time to go into a lot of detail, but there are things that have been done, proven strategies to engage students, which are being done at various levels at different parts of the country. For me, one of the most important goals is to get kids excited about learning, about being in school. For too long, the focus and the whole narrative in schools has been on testing and grades. And I've seen this in my own kids' schools. How do you we got this great course, but how do you get the grade? It's 10% for this, for class attendance, 10% for, the turning in assignments on time. That is sort of the basic narrative. And that doesn't work I think for most people. And there's been a huge amount of research over many decades on extrinsic motivation. In other words, doing things for some external purpose, like a grade, versus intrinsic motivation, which is doing things because you are internally motivated. Now, you're always going to have something that, most kids will need, some kind of testing or some kind of exam, something, but that shouldn't be the main thing driving how we teach kids. So I'm just going to give a couple of things, and Sandy, you should tell me how much time I have left. I probably used up most of my time. Is that?
You have not. You have not. You still have 4 minutes left.
Okay, great. And I'll just give you some clues. There's something called project-based learning. There's been a huge amount of work being done on this. In fact, George Lucas, the producer, director of Star Wars, etc., of Star Wars fame, who's been really in the trenches on education, started something called Edutopia. And I would highly recommend, for real live examples of how to get kids excited about learning, go to edutopia.org. And also the Lucas Foundation.org. They have been done a lot of, not the only ones, on project-based learning. It's an approach in which students explore real-world problems through individual and group projects. And I'll just mention briefly, and you can go on the line and see this, a teacher in San Jose, third grade teacher, had kids design and build a model for a house, and then a tiny house. And it is the most extraordinary thing to see how so excited these kids are, and how this project allowed the teacher to teach so many parts of the school curriculum. They had to figure out the minimum square footage. They had a structural engineer come into the class. They made the blueprints. They had to figure out the difference between total area of the house and the perimeter of the house. So you got all the math. Then they had the kids reading up about different approaches for building houses. So you got the reading in there. Then the kids eventually had to present their model to a client. And so they were taught on, posture, when you make the presentation, speak clearly, and so on. And it's so moving. There's a 7-minute video. You can go on the Buck Institute, which is also pioneered in this. And this is also not an approach just for elementary schools. You can use it in middle schools and high schools as another project. The chemistry teacher took the Flint, Michigan water crisis and had the students trying to identify one of the key elements that the Flint local authority had missed. I won't even try to explain. It was a chemistry problem of putting a certain chemical in the water to prevent the lead from leaching into the water. And again, you can just see students are engaged. I think some of the other strategies that have really, have been impressive, linked learning, linking students, and this is more at the middle and high school level, to career pathways. And it's not just going in and giving a lecture to the students about this career or that career or providing internships, but it's a well thought out strategy. It's tying the career pathways to courses, having career technical education courses, providing internships, and then providing support services in the schools like counseling and supplemental reading and so on. So these are all well thought out strategies. Another approach, which I think which has been shown to be hugely useful to motivate students, is dual enrollment strategies, where you link the high school, not only high school, but even in middle school and high school students to community colleges where they can take courses in both high school or middle and high school courses and college courses, which I find usually impressive. I couldn't have taken college courses in high school, but we have students who are really succeeding, and it provides them with a sense of pride that they're actually doing these college courses. It also gives them a taste of the college culture. It also allows them to kind of get out of the normal routine. So that's another strategy. And I'll just throw in one other thing, which is something which I saw in my own children that was so valuable. We have to bring other arts and music programs back into the schools. This is not necessarily for every student, but this used to be a key part of the school curriculum, and unfortunately, it's been eviscerated across the country. We're very fortunate in California. There's a big push right now to get an initiative on the ballot this November to invest $1 billion more into arts and education arts and music programs in the schools. I'm hoping that passes, because as you know, I'm sure many of you out there, the thing that really kept you in school was these other activities. And of course, arts and music can be part of the school curriculum. It's actually required, but it just has been offered in a very, very trimmed down and often non-existent fashion. I will just also say sports programs, similarly, it shouldn't just be for the students who are really serious, the JV and the varsity teams. It really should be available to more students. And unfortunately, those have also been cut back. But these are the kinds of things we need to be thinking about now and looking at who is doing it well, because there are people who are doing this. It's just how do we extend that more broadly to more schools and more students.
Thank you, Louis. I have a question before we open it up to reporters. Resources are not equal for all school districts. There were learning gaps even pre-pandemic. How do we bridge the learning divide in under-resourced schools?
Well, that is a problem. And I can't speak to the whole country.
Broadly.
Because, one of the challenges with, there's so many variations, not only within states, but within school districts themselves. But I don't think that money in and of itself is the problem, because I think it's a question of how are we using the funds. And this has also been much research has been done over many years. Does money make a difference? Well, it does make a difference, but only if you spend it in targeted ways that we know make a difference. So I do think there's a lot of reporting to be done on this, looking at where are the funds going? Are they being spent in ways that can be effective? Don't want to dodge the question, but I think that is a bigger problem right now, looking at whether the funds are being spent on these strategies that we know work. There is actually research that shows that these strategies work. I just mentioned this project-based learning, which sounds a little abstract until you look and actually see it in practice. But the Lucas Foundation did actually research that, that showed that students did better academically using this approach.
Thank you. We have two questions. The first one is from Henrietta Burrows. Henrietta, please ask your question and identify your news organization.
Thanks, Anita. It's the East Palo Alto Today newspaper in the Talking with Henrietta show. You had mentioned how the focus should not be on the preparation for tests. So where is the place for testing? And do you think that there should be a continuation of the SAT tests and other tests as graduation requirements and requirements for college entrance?
Well, I might have an opinion on this, but I do think that as far as the SATs, we are really moving away from that. It almost seems inevitable that at some point, sooner rather than later, and I think it's going to be sooner, is that sooner or later, but I think it's going to be sooner, where the SAT will either be optional or not required. I mean, we see that the UCs have now phased that out. East Palo Alto, you probably know that. the CSUs have done that. And this is definitely where things are going. You know, this is a complicated issue because there are people and, you know, good people who've looked at this, and there are people who will argue that this actually helps students on the margins who may not, you know, who have an opportunity. The grades aren't so good at the high school. If they have poor instruction, there's an opportunity for them to take these tests and show that they could actually do better. But I think on balance, the consensus now is that these are keeping kids who should be in school, out of college, more than they are helping.
Thank you.
But yeah.
Thank you, Henrietta. Our next question comes from Natalie Hansen. Natalie, could you please ask your question and identify your news organization?
Yes, thank you so much. And this is Natalie Hansen for Chico Soul News in California. You were discussing how we should be looking more at how funds are being used, not so much the amount of funds available. And I just wondered if you could speak a little bit to rural areas where money has been part of the issue, or it has been stated as part of the issue for allocation of resources. So especially in areas which have suffered perhaps natural disasters, continue to have a lack of reliable internet access, as so much of the US does, which tend to intersect with issues like homelessness and high ACEs scores. What would you suggest may be coming down the pike for these school districts to be assessing how the resources now available might be used, where they perhaps did not have that level of resources before?
Well, I just want to say that, you know, we do get into certain narratives, and there is a definite problem. Rural schools across the country tend to be under-resourced, and so I don't want to underplay that issue. At the same time, I will just say that right now, and you're from California, Chico, and I know there are lots of other people from around, you know, not only Californians on this call. But right now, the average amount going to California students is $21,000, which is, you know, an extraordinary amount. Now, that's not going to last. One of the issues is what happens, and that's because of all the money that came from the federal government and the state. It varies from district to district. But in California, in addition, has been really targeting funds at low-income students, English learners, many rural schools, as you know, a large number of English learners in those school districts. And so there is not the same disparities that exist now as there were before. School districts are and should be getting a lot more. And I do think that the school districts have to be held accountable. I think it would really be comparing what school districts are getting now compared to 5 years ago, compared to 10 years ago. Now, 2011 in California, the amount school districts are getting an average of $8,500. Now they're getting $21,000. And so what is happening to that money? That money needs to be targeted where it's going to really make a difference. That's not a downplay that rural schools have more challenges, just transportation, just getting kids there. That is something, you know, an urban district doesn't have to the same extent.
Louis, thank you so much for joining us. We move on to Allison Sokol of EdTrust. Allison will draw attention to schools which are succeeding in accelerating learning with some specific examples and what these schools share in common. Allison, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It is such a pleasure to be invited with that framing. That's always the lens that we bring to the work, but for that to be the ask, for us to come and talk about what we know works and that it is absolutely possible to accelerate students' learning is such a great opportunity. So thank you. I'm going to share my slides, or attempt to. Just let me know in a second if you can see them. Are you able to see my slides here?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay. So welcome. My name is Allison Sokol. I'm the Assistant Director of P12 Policy at the Education Trust, which, as Sandy said, is an organization based in Washington, D.C. And through research and advocacy, we work to close opportunity gaps that disproportionately affect students of color and students from low-income families. And today I'm going to be talking about addressing unfinished learning. So before I get into my presentation, I'm going to pause and answer the question a lot of people ask: what is unfinished learning? So the Education Trust is very intentional in our terminology. Unfinished learning is our way of talking about what others often call learning loss or learning gaps. We choose to use the phrase unfinished learning for two big reasons. The first is that it's a more asset frame that we hope signals that with resources and supports, students can absolutely make progress.
Sorry, Allison, our interpreter asked if you could just speak a little bit slower.
And the second reason that we use the phrase unfinished learning instead of learning loss is because we hope it shifts the focus away from blaming students and puts the responsibility on the systems. So you'll hear me use the phrase unfinished learning throughout my presentation, but in your head, you can know that what we mean is learning loss. So at the beginning of the pandemic, in March of 2020, the Education Trust partnered with a research firm called MDRC because it became immediately apparent that the pandemic was going to have a huge impact on students, and specifically students of color and students from low-income communities. And we wanted to be able to answer the question, how can we help these students and how can we accelerate their learning given the impact of pandemic and school building closures and the disproportionate health and financial impact of the pandemic on communities of color. Obviously, the research that we're drawing on is not research about how to accelerate students' learning in a global pandemic. This has been an unprecedented experience for us all, but we do know a lot about what works for accelerating students' learning and helping them catch up. We have decades of research to draw on. And we found that the strategies that are most effective for addressing students' unfinished learning fit in three buckets. They are not mutually exclusive, but they make it easy to talk about. So the first bucket is targeted intensive tutoring, which sometimes gets called high dosage tutoring. The second is expanded or extended learning time. And the third, and I would argue most important, is the importance of strong relationships. So I'm going to talk about each of these a little bit, acknowledging that I cannot go into the level of detail that we did in our research briefs. The first strategy is targeted intensive tutoring, which is a really impactful strategy when implemented well. It usually looks like one tutor or teacher working with one-on-one or a small group of students, 4 or fewer, providing concrete skill-building curriculum that helps those children master their unfinished learning while still being able to access and progress in grade level content. This chart is available in our resource. I won't go through the whole thing, but it helps lay out the trade-offs. No program is going to be perfect, but these are the kinds of considerations that guide our questions when we hear that a school or district is doing tutoring. We get very excited, but it's easy to talk about tutoring. What does it actually look like? We ask about who the tutors are, how many students will be in a group, and questions about how that tutoring time will be structured. The second bucket of strategies we found to have a lot of research and evidence behind it is expanded learning time. Many of the features of effective expanded learning time programs are very similar to the features of effective tutoring. If education leaders are going to add time onto a child's school day or add additional instructional time within the school day, such as an additional block of reading, we hope to see it in a small group with a high quality curriculum where students can get the kind of supports that they need. And finally, and as I said, most importantly, is the power of strong relationships, which I am sure our next speaker is going to talk about as well. Whether it be in the form of tutoring or expanded learning time, and of course, during the core part of the school day, ensuring that students are engaged in school and making academic progress, that we know what their social emotional needs are and can connect them and their families to the right supports, requires having strong relationships with adults in that building. There are great examples, and please let me know if I'm getting close to time. There are great examples of states and districts and individual schools implementing programs and strategies that align to the evidence. And we are very excited to see the impact, particularly for our most underserved students. Here are just a few examples. So we just released a brief in partnership with several national organizations, Future Ed and ERN, highlighting 5 states that we think are making smart and equitable investments in statewide tutoring programs, using the federal relief dollars that were mentioned earlier, as well as other state funds. These include Colorado, Louisiana, New Mexico, Tennessee, and Texas. And for more information about exactly what those states are doing to support district and school leaders in providing tutoring to students in need of support, I'm happy to share that resource. Oftentimes we see districts taking a district-wide approach. And in fact, that's something we hope to see. Nashville in Tennessee is a great example. There are 2 programs in that district that are very promising. The district is providing intensive tutoring to students in need of additional support, and they have implemented a program called Navigator, in which adults in the district connect on a regular basis to students and families to find out how the district can provide or connect them with supports and services, a wide range of supports and services, from housing, health, to address food insecurity, and of course, to provide academic supports. And we see many programs that have been implemented in individual schools. Saga Tutoring is a program for which there's a lot of evidence. Schools that adopt this program provide additional support to 9th graders as they engage in their Algebra 1 course, and they have seen incredible results of their tutoring approach. Future Forward Literacy is an early literacy tutoring program coupled with family engagement, there has been a lot of research supporting their approach. And the BAR program, Building Assets, Reducing Risks, is one of my favorite programs to talk about, and really provides a wide range of supports and services to ensure that the whole child's needs are met. This list would often include community schools, which I would talk about, but our next speaker will be able to do that in much more depth. Just a note that the federal government has provided a lot of money to support districts and schools in meeting the increased academic, social, and emotional needs of students. The total amount is $190 billion, the bulk of which came from the American Rescue Plan. And if you're curious how much your state or an individual state is receiving, we have a map on our website where you can look to find out more. A note that there is a requirement in the federal law that 20% of the money that each school district receives has to be spent on evidence-based strategies to address unfinished learning, like the ones I'm talking about today. And just a final note that while I was asked to speak about specifically addressing unfinished learning, of course, these strategies have to be part of a much broader effort to make schooling in this country more equitable and just. And so that includes more equitable funding, ensuring that all students have access to rigorous and culturally sustaining coursework, that they have supports to meet their social and emotional needs and attend schools that are positive, that they have access to high quality early childhood opportunities to get a strong start, and that all children have strong and diverse educators. This is the whole picture of what it's going to take in order to create an equitable and just school system in this country.
Allison, thank you so much. Our first question comes from Julian Doe. Julian.
Oh, thank you, Sunita. Studies from all over the world show that there's such a strong correlation between parents spending more time with children and higher academic performance. So during this pandemic, parents actually spent more time with their children than ever before. So why haven't these quantity and quality times between parents and children compensated for the many challenges that come with remote learning, or even accelerated learning for their children?
I'm just going to check my understanding of the question. Are you asking why, despite the fact that many families were able to spend additional time with their children, we're still seeing unfinished learning for many students?
I believe that's the question. Yes.
Okay. Well, I'll say that first of all, that is true for many, but not all families. Many families with parents or caregivers who were essential workers continue to go to work. Many older siblings were tasked with trying to continue their schoolwork while caring for younger siblings, and that many communities of color and low-income communities faced many challenges during the pandemic. I agree that I can certainly say in my own life, the pandemic has provided an opportunity to spend time with my children and has given many families insight into their children's academic experiences. And I certainly hope that districts and schools will continue to engage families and work to strengthen their community and family engagement, because we know, I agree, that parents are their children's first teachers, and it is very important that they be a part of the educational experience, especially so that parents of color and parents from low-income communities can have a voice at the table about how decisions are made and can fight for equity and a high-quality education for their children.
Thank you. Allison, I have a question for you before we move on to Hayan. Have you, regarding extended learning, which was the first bucket that you pulled up, have you looked at the impact of after-school programs and whether students who participate in such programs are better off academically?
So the research that we were drawing on did draw on studies of after-school programs, and it's hard to paint with a broad brush. Not all after-school programs are created equal. Just attending an after-school program doesn't guarantee that it will address students' academic needs or provide them with strong relationships, but there are many that do, those that sort of align with those criteria that I laid out, that are creating a space for students to get academic support, enrichment, such as music, art, and other activities to widen their their experiences, and strong relationships with adults.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Allison.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, we welcome your remarks. We move on to Hayan Kimner, who will focus on community schools and how they are attempting to bridge the learning gap. Hayan, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Great to be here. My name is Hayan Kimner, Kim Hayan. If I didn't say that, my mother would kill me. And I will be seeing her later this afternoon. A lot of folks have been hearing about community schools as a strategy that is being turned to as we think about pandemic recovery and pandemic response. And the next question, or the first question that most folks ask is, what is a community school? The words are broad enough that we can attribute a lot of meaning to both community and school. And as somebody who has been doing community schools work for over 20 years, this is a question that I still get as the first question. So a little bit of a reframe. Community schools do not refer to a program or a funding strategy. When we're talking about community schools, we're talking about a whole child, whole school improvement strategy, where districts and schools are working together and working with their community, teachers, students, families, staff, and partnering with community agencies and local government to align their resources behind improving student outcomes. A previous question was about communities or schools that have limited resources. A community school strategy is not just about co-locating services or providing what is sometimes referred to as wraparound programs and services, but recognizing that many communities have natural assets and strong relationships that are oftentimes not a part of the school fabric. When we think about and we look at what happened 2 years ago this week and next week, we looked at what was happening and saw that the calamity and the chaos of COVID actually brought some clarity, particularly for those school folks that were really responding to the urgency of the realities of young people and their families. So as Louis mentioned earlier, how is it that we can learn from these responses to change the way we think of education and business as usual? Some of the things that came up in those initial COVID responses were very organic and point to some of those strategies around what is most essential to good teaching and learning. And 4 of those things that both Louis and Allison spoke about were in terms of the centrality of family and student relationships. Those schools and districts that had strong relationships with families were much quicker to pivot to respond to distance learning, technology gaps, and really thinking through the ways to meet students where they were. It also meant that there was a very strong focus on integrated teacher and student supports. Most teachers are used to teaching students in front of them. Distance learning was a steep learning curve for everyone. Being able to provide those supports in ways that really brought in teacher voice and the organic innovation of our educators really was a prominent feature of these schools that did so well. It was also about collaborative leadership and practice. Schools were not dealing with this crisis alone. Strong communication and coordination with local departments of public health, as well as community-based organizations, oftentimes around the clock, really gave way to a different way of thinking about collaboration and partnership. We were all trying to row in one direction. And also, all of this was in service of student-centered learning. Students were we were trying to meet students where they were, either in terms of virtual learning or many of those strategies that Louis mentioned in terms of community-connected learning. How is it that we are able to take those lived realities of where students are and use those as opportunities for learning, not just academic content, but learning social and emotional skills, really thinking through who their community is and how they are placed within that context. So when we talk about when we're not in crisis and community schools, oftentimes people will lead with a description of community schools in terms of the programs, the things you might see that are different from a traditional school. Things like a medical clinic or a family resource center. But what is important to understand are the underlying pieces that matter the most. The relationships, the collaborative leadership between both leaders and stakeholders and staff, the student-centered learning that I spoke about, and the integrated student and teacher supports. What is on this slide, and we will have a copy of this also being sent out, are some examples of what that has looked like in practice. So the question is, why now? Why community schools now? This is a field that some might say is generations old. Others, like myself, have been working in this field for decades. Not only is this about learning recovery, not only is this about response to a pandemic, but this is an opportunity for transformation. And when we think about the just pure dollars that are out there to support these efforts, we can even just look at the billions of dollars that have come through to states, to districts, and to schools through federal recovery dollars, either through the CARES Act, the Omnibus Bill, the American Rescue Plan, in addition to existing federal dollars, such as the 21st Century Community Learning Centers, Promise Neighborhoods, Title IV, CHIP, Corporation for National and Community Service. There's so many to mention. The second piece is more recent. and just a few weeks old, in fact. And the full service community school expansion bill increased the federal amount for the federal community school grant from 30 million to 75 million. This is a grant program, a competitive federal grant program that I believe started in 2010. And so these efforts to really put community schools in action have been happening, and that this increase of funding is a testament to the work that they have been doing. Thirdly, the work of community schools has in some ways been both misunderstood and misinterpreted because there hasn't been coherence and alignment at the field level. Most of us have been busy doing the work and not necessarily communicating and aligning our work. Currently, the Community Schools Forward Task Force is a national task force, a second iteration of a task force brought together by the Brookings Institution, the Learning Policy Institute, the National Center for Community Schools at Children's Aid, and the National Coalition for Community Schools to really align the field, expand the opportunities for implementation, and then scale those with both fidelity and impact for young people. I'm joining this meeting from Oakland, where California has made an extraordinary big bet. The fiscal 21 budget has invested nearly $3 billion in a California Community Schools Partnership Program grant for the development and expansion of community schools. However, the big bet is not just these $3 billion, but it is when I reviewed very initially the fiscal year 21 budget, over $14 billion in investments in whole child strategies. So what we are encouraging our state and our districts and our schools to do is not think about community schools as a separate funding stream or a separate program, but as a means and an opportunity for alignment and coherence, and to supercharge these existing efforts, both in terms of their programs, their capacities, and their funding. As you all are media folks, I hope your next question is, where is a community school? And I have many examples, and this is just a very, very, very small number that does not reflect the richness of community schools practitioners around the country. Starting from the east to the west, the work in upstate New York is a phenomenal example of rural community school strategies. The Finger Lakes Community Schools Initiative sits between Rochester and Syracuse. New York City, the work of community schools in New York, it's a place where I used to work. They currently have 315 New York City schools with another 100 in process. In Boston, they have community hub schools, which are dual language schools, including what we believe is the first Haitian Creole dual immersion school in the country. In Kentucky, again, this is a great example of the work that is happening in rural communities. Partnering with higher education is the Berea Independent School District and their community schools work. In Illinois, the West Chicago Community Schools is really focused on newcomer students and English learners. Similarly, in Michigan, this is not, I don't know, is suburban. It sort of spans between urban and suburban and rural, the work of the Kent School Services Network. Utah, in the greater Salt Lake region with the leadership of the local United Way. In Oregon, at the county level, the Schools Uniting Neighborhoods effort in Multnomah County. In Southern California, there certainly is work happening in Los Angeles, in LA Unified, but I also wanted to have you all hear about the work happening in Anaheim. There's also wonderful work happening through the San Diego County Office of Education. And in Oakland, in my community, one of the schools that is part of this full service community school district is Oakland International High School, which is an alternative continuation high school explicitly for newcomer and English learner students. So thank you so much. Really look forward to your questions.
And there are a number of questions for you, Hayan.
Oh boy.
I think we're going to start with Jong-Won Lee, who has a very interesting question. Jong-Won, would you please unmute yourself and identify your news organization?
Hi, I'm Jong-Won Lee from Yonhap News Agency. Yes, I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, and in Georgia, the Republican legislature pushing school bill that offers $1,000 voucher toward the private education for students who leave public school and get apply the private school. So they argue that this voucher will help students who failed in public school to get in private school. Could you share your opinion about private school voucher program in South?
I am not at all an expert in private school or voucher programs. I will say that when we are talking about community school strategies, it is about recognizing that there are many families that have not been connected to or well served by their local public schools. And community school strategies really start with the relationships of asking students and families what it is that they want, what their hopes and dreams are for their young people, and how is it that not just the school, but community partners and the community spaces that they live in and grow up in can work together to be able to meet their needs and their vision.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a question on behalf of Rosanna Huang. Families are concerned about learning loss and multilingual learners. Could you please provide some updates?
There is definitely a demonstrated recognition of the literacy crisis that is happening as a result of the interrupted learning that has happened over the last 2 years. I am not familiar with the specific data on what that entails. There are many schools and school districts that, as part of operating, recognize that you meet young people and their families where they are. So not only in terms of thinking about it with this reframing of learning loss, but asking where are they coming in from and how do we accelerate where they are coming in from. That requires data, that requires information. And I don't mean just testing data, it means understanding that data includes all of the stories and the realities that young people and their families are bringing in to the school door from day one. And having teachers and education teams work with that data to be able to tailor instructional strategies that meet their needs.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up to all three speakers to answer a final question. What is the 30-second soundbite that you would like us as reporters to take away from this briefing? Hey, Ian, let's start with you.
I just muted myself. Great. My 30-second soundbite is that all schools can be community schools. This is about reframing and putting forward the central importance of students and relationships as part of doing this work. Programs and strategies without those trusting relationships in place will not get us to where we need to be, both in terms of pandemic recovery as well as public education transformation.
Thank you so much, Hey. And Allison, we move on to you.
My 30-second soundbite is that all students can learn, and that with the right supports and strong relationships with adults, schools absolutely can address students' unfinished learning. And the investment from the federal government is an unprecedented opportunity and unprecedented resources to make those things happen.
Thank you so much, Allison. Louis, are you still with us?
I'm here.
There you go. Final word.
Well, I'm just really inspired by the various strategies that my fellow panelists have put on the table. And I will just say that I think the key now is to, without trying to downplay or diminish or sugarcoat the challenges, but in our reporting to really be focusing on what schools need to be doing and can be doing, to ask the question, oh, how many community schools do we have? Have you considered that? What are we doing? What is your school or district doing to strengthen the relationships with families, which we've also heard are so important? Have you attempted these project-based learning strategies? And then also to elevate the people who are doing that work. Any organization, you're going to find people doing great work, even in the districts that are really struggling. So that's what, and I would say the key also in our writing is not to leave that to the 17th or 18th or 19th paragraph in the story as kind of an afterthought, but to try to get it higher up in your story. So when readers are reading it, they feel there is something that can be done. And as opposed to, well, this is hopeless, kids aren't succeeding, what do we do now?
Excellent point. Sandy, closing remarks?
Well, I'm just super grateful to our three speakers because you have reframed the narrative. You've done exactly what we asked. And the idea of turning from learning loss to unfinished learning, partly so that we're not blaming the student, which learning loss tends to do, is for all of us as writers, a wonderful, just very simple takeaway. But all three of you enriched my understanding a great deal. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sunita.